So there are suspicions about the Bangladeshis getting close to China, and some of it is reflected in the kind of joint statement and the kind of invitations that the Bangladeshis have given to the Chinese on a range of projects. Bangladesh is in a bit of a tight spot economically and otherwise. The expectations which they had from the United States and from some of the other countries in the West, uh, those have not fructified. This kind of injured innocence that Yunus's Goebbels seems to harbor about India, that India did not respond in time. What was the response coming from Bangladesh at that point of time? They were constantly bad mouthing India even then. To expect that you can carry out these kind of pogroms in Bangladesh and there'll be no response from India, that the red carpet will be rolled out for you, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. Under the current dispensation, it is becoming a important neighbor in a very negative sense. So it's very easy to uproot everything and destroy everything, very difficult to build some new institutions. Bangladesh could go through a lot of turmoil and churn before things start settling down.
Bangladesh's Chief Advisor Dr. Muhammad Yunus embarked on his first state visit after assuming office. He chose China as his destination, and expectedly, the move attracted intrigue as well as skepticism. I'm with strategic affairs expert Sushant Sareen to discuss the timing, the purpose, and what it means for New Delhi. Mr. Sareen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Anuja.
Right, Dr. Yunus has just described Beijing as a reliable partner and a friend. How are you looking at it from New Delhi?
Look, these kind of descriptions are pretty boilerplate. You don't go to China and say that you've been an unreliable partner. So you are going to say, you are going to use rather flowery language to describe your relationship. And yes, let's admit that Bangladesh and China relations have built up over the years. If you just look at the trade patterns, China is probably the largest trading partner of Bangladesh. Uh, it imports virtually nothing from Bangladesh, but it's deluged the Bangladesh economy with its exports, and it has been it's been extending its tentacles, I would put it, in Bangladesh, in not just the defense sector, but also in the infrastructure sector. And there are some reports also of many of the Bangladeshi politicians siding up with the Chinese. It's part of this new dispensation in Bangladesh, especially this new dispensation. The relationship has been there in the past as well, even during Sheikh Hasina years. But I think under this new dispensation, partly to just thumb their nose at India, they are hobnobbing with India's enemy countries or adversaries like Pakistan and China. Partly for that reason, and partly for the reason that Bangladesh is in a bit of a tight spot economically and otherwise. The expectations which they had from the United States and from some of the other countries in the West, uh, those have not fructified. In fact, there are reasons to believe that the screws might be tightened on the current dispensation in Bangladesh, especially because of its treatment of minorities and because it's siding up with China. Now, that's a kind of a catch 22. Uh, so there are suspicions about the Bangladeshis getting close to China, and some of it is reflected in the kind of joint statement and the kind of invitations that the Bangladeshis have given to the Chinese on a range of projects. And I don't think that's going to sit very well in the US. And also because in the West, I think they're so preoccupied with their own problems that Bangladesh really does not figure on their radar screen. So I think the Bangladeshis are also trying to jostle for some kind of attention. And because they're not getting much traction from India, and for very understandable reasons, you can't be bad mouthing India all the time. You can't be taking digs at India all the time. You can't be doing hostile and inimical actions against India and then expect that India will, keep rolling out the red carpet for you. That's not going to happen. So yes, I think they will start looking at China. What they get from China and how much indebted they become to China. Uh, I think that is something which we will see in the next couple of years if this trajectory continues. But for the Bangladeshis, I think it would be good if they were to take some lessons from what has happened to countries like Pakistan and others, where the Chinese came bearing a lot of gifts, and now many of those gifts are like a millstone around the necks of those countries, having to pay off debts. And even in this particular visit, one of the primary things that the Bangladeshis were asking for is that the Chinese should reduce the interest rates on their debt, because they're finding it difficult to service whatever debts they have to service for the Chinese. So those are going to be the issues going forward as well. But for now, I think it's a bit of diplomatic showmanship and maybe thumbing the nose at India.
But don't you think Dr. Yunus is also playing the delicate balancing act well? Because since you mentioned United States, Yunus hosted the US Army Pacific Deputy Commander just a day before he embarked for China.
No, so they will try and balance it out, but I think given the kind of dynamics that is developing in the region, how much of this balancing act will they be able to pull off? I, again, the Bangladeshis seem to think that they are sitting on. Again, it's the Pakistani mindset. So, like the Pakistanis, the Bangladeshis think they're sitting on a very vital piece of geography. Uh, Now, there is very difficult to get over that kind of delusions which people harbor about their geographical location. But a geographical location uh, has to be placed in a certain context, and in the context in which the Bangladeshis are trying to present themselves. How does their geographical location become very vital for other countries in the region? It becomes vital and viable in the context of India. But if the Bangladeshis are going to shoot themselves in the foot by spoiling their relations with India, as they seem to be hell bent on doing, especially with the kind of thugs who have taken over, the dispensation, or running the dispensation in Bangladesh today, these so-called students. I don't see how that relevance comes in. Secondly, I don't think the Bangladeshis are going to burn their bridges either, or can afford to burn their bridges either with the United States, which is one of their largest export destinations, or with the Chinese, because they're already getting into the hawk with the Chinese on debt and on a number of other issues. So they will try and play that balancing act. But how well will that balancing act sit well with the Trump administration, for one? How well will it sit well with us, for a second? And then how much will the Chinese also be open to this kind of a balancing act, but for the Bangladeshis, if they're trying to continuously trying to hedge their bets? So I think
Right.
it's not going to be as easy as many people think it will be.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't look easy. Also, since you say that Dhaka is badmouthing New Delhi, the press secretary of Yunus claimed that Dhaka showed interest in Yunus's visit to New Delhi much before they had even planned a trip to China. But they, quote unquote, received not a very positive response from New Delhi. Why do you think that's the case then?
But that's for understandable reason. This kind of injured innocence that Yunus's Goebbels seems to harbor about India, that India did not respond in time. What was the response coming from Bangladesh at that point of time? They were constantly bad mouthing India even then. The people who had been appointed in this particular dispensation, whether it was these old generals, some of them with the Pakistani mindset who had come into power, whether it was the Islamists who were running amok on the streets of Bangladesh, whether it was on the issue of the treatment of minorities and all the other stuff which was happening, how can they so blithely ignore all of that happening in their country and simply indulge in that Goebbelsian kind of a thing, that deny everything, that nothing has happened? You tell them that, look, 80 Hindus have been killed. No, yes, they've been killed, all right, but they've been killed in, because this was normal criminal activity or normal feuding that was taking place. How come so many Muslims had not been killed? Only Hindus were being killed in Bangladesh? There are a number of difficult questions that can be asked. And just yesterday, for example, we had a statement by the External Affairs Minister in Parliament where he says, like, last year there were 2,400 attacks on minorities in Bangladesh. How is that conscionable? And to expect that you can carry out these kind of pogroms in Bangladesh and there'll be no response from India, that the red carpet will be rolled out for you. I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. And then the fact that right from day one they started hobnobbing with the Pakistanis, opening up the doors for the Pakistanis, and just look what happened. Whether it was some of the Indian secessionist groups, suddenly the Bangladeshi courts started releasing these people. They started releasing terrorists. How do you think that would have gone down well with the government in India? So obviously, if there was a bit of a cold shoulder shown to them, it was basically a signal that, look, if you want good relations with India, you have to be more sensitive to India's concerns, our security concerns, and our other political concerns. And if you're not going to be able to do that, and you are going to continue to take pot shots in India, blame India for all your other political problems, then obviously then India is not going to be very, very welcoming towards you. So this injured innocence business, which Yunus and his Goebbels has, I think it needs to be called out.
But don't you think one of the major bone of contention, maybe not for Dr. Yunus, but at least for Dhaka overall, is that the fact that India is sheltering former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who just yesterday, in fact, there was a new criminal case filed against Hasina over an alleged plot to overthrow the Yunus government while she sits in India. And of course, there are other cases that you're obviously privy to: murder, abduction, inciting riots, corruption, and genocide. And they all think there's a not just in terms of politically, but like in general, the people of Dhaka feel like she should come back to Dhaka and face the court. But India is not allowing that. So don't you think that's the major bone of contention, while whatever you mentioned is, if not equally, at least important?
No, they need to mature up on this. Number one, what are their courts worth? They are kangaroo courts of the worst kind. In their criminal justice system, journalists have been booked for murder. On what and on what the cases were? If you look at some of those cases, there are bona fide journalists. Okay, maybe the journalist was close to the previous dispensation. Do you book a journalist for murder? They have been sacked en masse, okay, from their jobs. It's literally a kind of a massacre of journalism which has taken place in Bangladesh. Now, when you talk about the judicial system in Bangladesh, all the people who were against whom cases were already running, many of them who had been convicted, have overnight been given pardons in Bangladesh by these same courts. And now these same courts are overactive in booking, for example, minority leaders. Okay, they've been active in I don't know how many hundreds of cases have been slapped on Sheikh Hasina. Now that is one. So their judicial system is just not above board. Okay, first and foremost. Secondly, there is this grouse among many of the Bangladeshis that, look, India was backing the Sheikh Hasina government. Now, look, India's position was very clear. India's position was that, yes, Sheikh Hasina had been a friend of India. Yes, Sheikh Hasina had shown a lot of sensitivity to India's security concerns, and she had dismantled the infrastructure of terrorism that had been set up by the BNP and the Jamaat Islami in collaboration with the Pakistanis inside Bangladesh. So there were these terrorist groups, both ethnic terrorist groups from the northeastern states, as well as religious terrorist groups, which are being sponsored and being supported by the Bangladeshi regime back then. Now, Sheikh Hasina comes in and she understands that she needs to improve relations with India because that's going to be beneficial for Bangladesh. And in order to be able to do it, she needs to address some of India's security concerns. That's all she did. So we became good friends under Sheikh Hasina's dispensation. And Bangladesh gained a lot from the kind of policies that Sheikh Hasina adopted towards India. So India obviously treats her as a friend. Now, the thing is that despite the fact that there were concerns within India on how politics in Bangladesh was being played out, and by the admission of top officials in India, from the external affairs minister to some of the other officials in the Ministry of External Affairs, they have all said that we used to take up these matters behind closed doors with the Sheikh Hasina government. We would try and impress upon them some of the things that we thought were not in Bangladesh's interest. But India, at the end of the day, is a neighboring country, a foreign country. So there is a limit. Sorry, there's a limit to how much we can interfere in Bangladesh's internal affairs. It is, as a good friend, we can apprise the government of the day where we think that they need to relook at some of their policies, some of the stuff which is happening in their country, and address those issues. Now, if the government of that country does not do it, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to then say that, okay, fine, we are now breaking off relations with you because you are not doing what we asked you to do? The moment we do that, these same Bangladeshi characters will turn around and tell us, why are you interfering in our affairs? Okay. Now, if we don't do it, they say, why didn't you interfere in our affairs? So, for example, today you have this Yunus regime. I can't call it a government. It's a regime. Really, it's not even elected. So you have this regime out there which is indulging in a lot of stuff which India does not like. Should India now start interfering in Bangladesh's relations and try and effect some kind of a regime change? Now, if we do that, they will say India is playing the big brother, interfering in our relation. If we don't do it, they will say, why didn't you do it at that point of time? If you had a problem, why didn't you bring it up at that point of time? So it's like a catch-22 situation again for India. And to make this an issue, to ruining the relationship with a country which virtually surrounds you on three sides, and a country with which, if you engage in very close cooperation, there are huge benefits for Bangladesh. It's Bangladesh's choice. If Bangladesh doesn't deal with us properly, we can live without Bangladesh. Bangladesh has to decide whether it can live without us.
Mr. Sareen, in your view, do you think there should be more dialogue, constructive dialogue between New Delhi and Dhaka?
Absolutely. I think, look, India does consider Bangladesh to be a very important neighbor. There's no doubt about it. Okay. But it becomes a very important neighbor. Now, it can become an important neighbor in a positive sense or in a negative sense. Under Sheikh Hasina, because of the kind of cooperative mechanism, projects that were being worked out between the two countries, it was an extremely important neighbor in a very positive sense. Under the current dispensation, it is becoming an important neighbor in a very negative sense, because we again are apprehensive that old system where they were sponsoring terror groups operating in India inside Bangladesh will restart. Now, ideally, countries like India and Bangladesh should have a very robust interaction. We should have a constant dialogue going on. We should be able to sit at a table and thrash out many of the issues that are creating problems, and also be sensitive to what the other government's compulsions can be, what it can and what it cannot do. But that's a matter of, a dialogue, negotiations, maybe some bargaining. And I'm all for it. In fact, I think that is the way we should be going about it. But you cannot have a situation like that in a climate of hostility. You cannot have a situation like that when there are constant recriminations coming from Dhaka directed at Delhi. If you have stuff like that, then you cannot move forward. And you cannot have that kind of a dialogue in the face of these blank Goebbels type denials that everything is hunky-dory in Bangladesh, the minorities are absolutely safe, there are no crimes against minorities taking place, that they are very well protected, that Bangladeshi society is actually a very secular, law-abiding, peaceful society. Everything which we know is not the case. Okay, so these blank denials by Yunus's Goebbels is not going to help matters. I think we should be upfront. We should have candid conversations. We don't need to do it, on the public square. We don't need to do this very publicly. Maybe we can have a very, very frank and candid discussion behind closed doors, which is what we would have even with Sheikh Hasina, with her government, and she was no pushover. When she thought that India was requesting something which she thought was not in Bangladesh's interest, she would not give in, which is what is expected of the leader of a country. Uh, whether her analysis of that, what India was requesting, is right or wrong is another matter. But there were many issues on which she would simply dig her heels in. We can have those conversations, and we should have those conversations. You cannot do that, if you have this denial, if you have these recriminations. I don't think it's going to be possible in a situation like that.
All right. The ties, diplomacy in general, it just seems very complicated at the moment between Dhaka and New Delhi. But it just, unfortunately, it seems like it's going to be even more uncertain in the months to come. It's being said that Bangladesh might hold its general elections by the end of this year or early next year. Now, these are all talks. These are all reports. We don't have a confirmation on it. But one thing that's erupting in Bangladesh is that the students that you were referring to previously, they are thinking of forming a political party in the next election. And I have been speaking to some of these students who are formulating this political party. And some of the things they have been saying, I can't name who this person is, but I can tell you what this person is saying. He says that I can only tell you that we have the people's mandate. What we are promising is an uproot of the old political establishment in Bangladesh. How optimistic should one be?
Look, they've already formed one party. I think it's called National Citizens Charter or something, National Citizens Party, something like that. I think there are a couple of parties already being formed. Uh, in the exuberance of youth, people think they have answers to all the questions, and there is this very fascist kind of a attitude that we will uproot the old and plant the new. Um, what is the new that they are wanting to plant? There's no clarity on that. What is the old they are wanting to uproot? So it's very easy to uproot everything and destroy everything. Very difficult to build some new institutions. And there is this, again, this is such a Pakistani attitude, and I can show you many people in Pakistan who keep saying this. Uh, Catch hold of 5,000 people, butcher them on the streets of Lahore and Islamabad, and Pakistan will become paradise. And I'm sure you'll hear something similar in Bangladesh. Okay. And then, of course, there are those mullahs who are fulminating on the streets all across Bangladesh. There is that factor. There is this somewhat leftist, Islamized, radicalized so-called youth leaders who suddenly think they have all the answers to all the problems, which I think in the 20s everybody has. So I'm not surprised that these guys think the same way. But what have they been able to solve? They can't solve their own problems within their own organizations, and something which you see virtually on a daily basis, with fights breaking out in universities and colleges all across Bangladesh. So if these guys were such hotshot Socrates and Plato's put together, maybe they would have at least managed to convince their own flock of students that they have a plan of action. And if they have a plan of action, why don't you bring it out in the public domain, let people discuss it and see whether it's a workable plan? It's all very well to say that we will change everything, bring in something new, do this, do that, have revolutionary fervor. Towards what end? The revolutions always, as it's said, revolutions always eat their own children. And something similar might happen in Bangladesh also. So it's my own sense is that Bangladesh is going to go through. I hope it doesn't, but I fear that Bangladesh could go through a lot of turmoil and churn before things start settling down, because it's very easy to do away with the established political parties, and I'm not saying that these were guys who were poster boys of liberalism or of probity in public life. Far from it. None of them were. But the fact is that at least there is a certain system. Now, reforming a system is probably a tad easier than bringing in a completely new system. So let's see how the Bangladeshis go forward. We don't even know if there are going to be elections uh, by the end of this year, or as Yunus says, maybe by the mid of next year. So that deadline keeps getting extended. There isn't any consensus as yet on what is the new constitution going to be, what are the new reforms they are going to be bringing in. Different parties who have given their inputs are talking about different things. So there is no consensus on that also. Uh, and who is going to bring in the constitutional reforms? How are those constitutional reforms going to be accepted as a consensus document? Because constitutions have to be consensus documents. It's just a bunch of people, unelected bunch of people, who are consulting other people and then coming out with a document. How are you going to make that constitutional document accepted? I think there are going to be serious questions about that are going to arise going forward. And finally, I think when all these students and others talk about this brave new world that they will be entering, and that they have the support of the people has to be demonstrated through a free and fair election. Support of the people can claim the support of 100 million Indians today. Who's to challenge me? How are you going to challenge me? Right?
Don't you think the support was on full display last year during the protests?
No, but that's a different issue, right? There were protests. How many people were there out on the streets during the protests? It was, Bangladesh has a population of what, almost 180, 190 million people, right? How many people were there on the streets? When people vote in an election, okay, the electorate would be roughly about 55% of the total population. So that's about maybe 90 million people. I don't have all the numbers. Maybe 50% people vote. That's about 45 million people. Were there 45 million people on the streets of Bangladesh? No. Were there 20 million people? No. So when you look at a protest and you say that, well, this reflects the public mood, maybe, yes, there was anger against the Sheikh Hasina government. So a lot of people came out. Does this mean all those people who came out are actually rooting for those students? Very often when protests take place, there is somebody spearheading the protest. A lot of people get attached to a protest, not necessarily because they agree with everything that the spearhead represents, but because they largely agree with the direction of the protest against a particular government or on a particular issue. So let's,
No,
Ananya,
absolutely. But it did seem like, and continues to seem like,
let
that
me
the
give you
people are.
very quickly, let me give you an example. When the India Against Corruption campaign was taking place, okay, on this whole Nirbhaya issue and all, a lot of people, it was being spearheaded by the India Against Corruption guys, but a lot of people latched on to that protest simply because they felt very strongly about that particular case. Did
Mhm.
all those people go ahead and support India Against Corruption? No. So I think we need to be careful about claims that somebody or the other represents the bulk of the public opinion in Bangladesh. Let elections decide that. I don't have any problem with whoever the people of Bangladesh elect. Uh, I'll only have a problem with that if those people are inimical to India. But otherwise, it's Bangladesh's problem who they elect.
All right, I want to go back to Yunus's visit to Beijing. There was a statement, it's all procedural. After the visit and after the talks, both the countries release a statement. And in Bangladesh statement, there was one line that caught my eye, which said Bangladesh firmly opposes an independent Taiwan. It seemed a little misplaced, but I'm trying to understand what's at play here.
No, this is a standard Chinese playbook, which is essentially one China policy. Now, virtually every country would endorse the one China policy, which meant that nobody's going to question the status of Tibet, nobody's going to question the status of Taiwan, nobody will support independence for Taiwan. So I think this is something that the Chinese would have certainly insisted on, and the Bangladeshis would have simply rubber stamped what the Chinese insisted on without applying their mind, or because it was diplomatically convenient for them to do so. Uh, Nothing more needs to be read in that. Uh, I think India is one of the few countries today which does not allow any reference to this one China policy in joint communiques. But most other countries, there is this standard line: uh, we uphold the one China policy, or in this specific case, we oppose the independence of Taiwan. I won't look beyond that.
Do you see this changing diplomacy when it comes to Beijing, Dhaka, New Delhi? Do you see this could actually change how we know and see South Asia right now?
I think that change is taking place. I don't think we can deny uh, the Chinese ingress in the region, their expanding footprint, their their economic involvement in many of the countries of the region, uh, and that is quite visible. That's happening all the time, and I think we need to recognize that reality for what it is, and we have to understand that a lot of the old ways in which countries in the subcontinent interacted with each other, or the power dynamics that were there maybe 20 years back, those power dynamics are likely to change. uh, will they change for the better? I don't think so, but they're going to change, and there is nothing that we can do to stop that change from taking place. So we will have to adapt to those changing dynamics. There will be greater contestation. Many of the countries feel that they are now in a position uh, where they think that they can play China against India within the region and maximize their own benefit. Some of it, I would grant to them that that will be good diplomacy on their part. Some of it would be that. Some of it, of course, would be more, in a sense, diplomatic gamesmanship that would be taking place, trying to appease China and maybe not antagonize India beyond a point. So I think that is something which is something that we'll have to contend with uh, for the foreseeable future. That's not going to change.
All right, Mr. Sareen, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us your insights.
Thanks a lot.